Good morning, everyone. I hope you had a good conference yesterday with probably some late night parties, and thank you for making your time to join us early. So we are going to do the kickoff, mostly summarizing what we are going to do for the remainder of this year and next year. And then we'll start with the regular, track. So for those of you who do not know much about the Open System Firmware project, there is a lot of confusion about OSF. OSF is not open source, it is Open System Firmware. The reason behind that is Open System Firmware essentially includes the vendor proprietary blobs, but there is an open, platform specific element on top of that to really package it as the bootable firmware for a given platform, server platform. So it is Open System Firmware. The project has been existing since 2019. So we have Dong Wei. Dong, he's the IC rep from ARM. And then myself, I am Reddy Chagam from Intel. I've been doing a lot of, firmware-specific focus for Xeon platforms. And then my co-lead, Jonathan. Jonathan, do you want to introduce?
Yeah, I'm Jonathan. I'm a software engineer in Meta.
The standard Open Compute links, if you go to the opencompute.org and then go to the Open System Firmware, you can actually see the wiki, you can actually see the meeting, and then recordings and everything is actually there. And we meet actually 2 different time zones. I think we started this probably last year. We used to have only the US time zone. But we ended up actually having an APAC-friendly time zone as well, alternate. So we actually switch, back and forth. One is in the night, the other one is actually, during 10 a.m. PST. Last year, we spent a lot of time and energy to essentially figure out what is the firmware role when it comes to platform badging. And that's essentially the OSF checklist. The checklist basically includes, what is the best way to, all the collateral, what is the best way to build your, can you build it, the licensing and everything else. All those things, including the third-party packages and everything, need to be actually available in the OSF GitHub. Me and Jonathan will actually take a look at it and then go through the approval process. So for a given platform. So for the OCP acceptance, you do need to actually fill in the OSF checklist and go through the approval process. And it's not required for OCP inspired. And then there has been some changes in the spec submission process. I want Jonathan to expand on that. I was not there for the last 2 weeks, and things have changed quite a bit. So the base spec and all that stuff, Jonathan, if you want to explain.
Yeah. So the motivation of having OCP acceptance and the OSF checklist tied together is that when people go to marketplace, for example, let's say if you go to marketplace, you look at the product, right? Let's say, just take an example. Okay, Win-Win's Huawei 3 and Huawei 2 are the top 2 most viewed marketplace products, right? So you look at the hardware, now you wonder, what promise does the hardware deliver? How does it run on my workload, right? I want to get the evaluation very quickly, so how do I do that? So OSF provides the ability. You can build firmware and customize as you wish. All right, you have full control. So that's the reason for the OSF acceptance. So the OCP acceptance and OCP inspired, they are meant for the product submission. So recently in the OCP hardware project, they say, in addition to product submission, we also need to have base spec and the design spec, right? So those base spec and the design spec submission process is another track comparing to the product submission. So those are 2 parallel tracks. They don't affect each other. So I just want to emphasize that with all the discussions about the base spec and the design spec, on the product submission side, no change.
Yeah. All right, thanks, Jonathan. So the focus areas for 23, now obviously we need to continue focusing on the platform badging. So anytime we have a new platform and when they want the product spec goes through the approval process for new platforms, we have to go through the badging process for OSF as well. So it's mostly in a sustaining mode. But we are also looking at, there are wide variety of platforms that are actually above and beyond just the server itself. You have switches, both network switches as well as the CXL switches. So we need to figure out what does that mean for the badging, the edge. The servers have different requirements, different form factor requirements. And then you also have, modular devices too. So we need to look at what does OSF badging process, look like for the new form factors, new devices, new switches, whether it is networking or CXL, that we have to spend some time to figure out exactly what does it mean. A lot of this checklist process is very, very rigorous and time consuming. So we have to go through a lot of approvals, get the other project team members to actually agree to it, and then we have to go to IC committee to get the approvals. So there is quite a bit of work in front of us. The specs and collateral, obviously the part and parcel of all these product specs is that you have a way to take the platform and then deploy the firmware through open source elements, and then be able to build it and then be able to program and then reboot the platform and power on the platform and all that stuff. A lot of that requires white paper, solution recipes and all that stuff. That will continue to be the focus. You heard about the sustainability as the fifth tenet. So there is a lot that goes on in the circular economy, specifically when it comes to firmware on the server platforms. So we have to kind of look at the sustainability element and then look at what does that mean from the open system firmware perspective and focus on that element. And like I said, the edge, and there is a lot of focus on the modular hardware building blocks. There is heavy focus on, there is a processor component and there is the device component, there is a networking component. There is a lot of design specific focus through DCMHS that we have to look at what does it mean for the firmware. When you actually plug in a new device, how do you update the firmware of the device? So the modular, the focus and then the firmware element on top of that, we have to actually spend some time. The last but not least, we haven't spent any time on the firmware updates, specifically the boot time requirements, and then when you update the firmware, what are the runtime, the firmware update requirements, things like when you update the firmware, you should not be able, you shouldn't actually go and, reboot the server. Specifically, this is very important for infrastructure as a service type of, platforms where uptime is a very critical component. So we haven't spent a whole lot of time on the firmware updates where we want to actually look at it and say, do we need to have specs for cloud requirements? What does that look like? The test and validation, Jonathan, do you want to take some time on the community lab? I know you have talked to a few folks.
Yeah, so OCP community lab has been flowing around for quite some time. But with recent OCP Foundation leadership team, we had a few meetings in these several days. They really want to push this forward. So I hope that in the next few months, we will see some activities there. We think OCP Community Lab will benefit three types of users. One is OCP adopters, potential OCP adopters can get their hands on OCP gears very quickly and do what they need to do, so with a minimum overhead. And then for the OCP projects, right? So the OCP project, like our checklist or test validation group, right? They can utilize. The third type is for open source communities and for academics. Like, for example, the open source communities could use those servers for their website. Even OCP Foundation could use those websites. So their IT managers are very excited about this. Okay.
Awesome. Thanks, Jonathan. So the cross-project team coordination is something that we have to continue to work server project team has a bunch of sub-projects where there is a lot of firmware-specific focus. Edge is another one, the security, and then the hardware manageability. So we'll have to continue to actually work with the peer projects and sub-projects, and then figure out the best way to synergize the firmware-specific focus. And then the regional meetups, this is something, Dong, do you want to take some time on cover the Taiwan meetup, ARM System Ready meetup, and just a high level on what we want to do there, bringing in the broader ODM into the mix, just as a high level.
Yes, sorry. So yesterday, actually, we were sitting at the meet and greet area during lunch, and the topic came up that we need to bring the OSF to the Taiwan regional market as well. And it just happens that ARM is organizing a meeting, a System Ready workshop on November 4th in Taipei. So the audience seems to be kind of overlapping because we were collecting a lot of the ODMs and OEMs from Taiwan to participate. So the idea is that we can use the same venue to collaborate and talk about OSF.
Thanks, Don. And then last but not least, going forward, we want to have focused technical discussions in the OSF meetings. Now, there are a lot of emerging, we are not restrictive on what type of stack that we really would like to promote. So there are a bunch of, the bootloader stacks, things like Core Boot, Tiana Core, Slim Bootloader, Min platform, UEFI-based Min platform. So, but there are emerging ones as well. So we need to pay attention to that and then continue to support that. So Orboot is a good example. Runtime RAS capability, we haven't spent a whole lot of time on what does the open system firmware role look like in the runtime RAS, the support. You probably heard quite a bit about SMI handlers, lots of, the cloud CSPs do not prefer runtime RAS through the SMI handler capability. That actually creates a lot more uncertainty from a performance and jitter perspective. So we have to look at runtime RAS capability and see what we want to do in that space. Within the context of open system firmware, a lot of focus on Linux boot, as you probably know, which is a very, very critical component for all the work that we do in the open system firmware project. That will continue to be the focus. The KExec aspect of that, the compatibility with different kernel builds, and then KExec and Linux boot, and then of course the payloads. Things like Windows and VMware payload, something that we haven't actually spent a whole lot of time. So we do need to figure out the best way to bring in the broader operating system portfolio, not just the Linux, as part of the payload focus. And then obviously the Intel has the firmware support package. There are changes that come gen over gen. We have to pay attention to that, from a Xeon platform support perspective, right? So those are the focused technical discussions. It's not comprehensive, but a few meta themes. With that, we have an exciting set of talks today. This essentially includes silicon vendors, hyperscalers like Meta, and then we have independent bias vendors. IBVs is what we call, and then obviously the ODMs and OEMs. So we have pretty much a broad set of talks. Stay tuned, and we'll start with the update from Johnny, who is from Vivin, on the OCP Crater Lake, enabling aspect for the open system firmware. And with that, let's get into the regular track. Any questions before we have like a couple of minutes?
Yeah.
Taiwan one, Don.
Yeah, I think what I would like to do is probably I will send some of the information to the OSF mailing list.
Yeah, I think that would be ideal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll just use the OSF mailing list, assuming you all have subscribed to it. So
yeah,
we'll just communicate through that.
Yeah. Also, we have almost bi-weekly meetings with Taiwan, as Reddy also mentioned. So that would be a good spot to mesh and talk as well. So we are limited, right? We actually wanted to work with a broader community. So we want to hear your suggestions, your feedbacks, and what you want to talk, what you want to work on. So together with us.
Yeah, we love your engagement and involvement. And firmware being such a narrow area, you can actually see that only the close-knit community actually gets together and talks about it. So the more we get, we have, the volunteers actually, participate, better off we will be collectively in the OCP, OSF community. So we love your participation. Okay, with that, we have Johnny.
Yeah, over there.